Hello guys, welcome to yet another fascinating journey through time. In this video, we're going to explore one of the most challenging periods in human history, the Little Ice Age, and discover how people, without access to modern technology, not only managed to survive, but innovated in ways that still amaze us today. We'll uncover the secrets of shared warmth, forgotten architectural ingenuities, clothing techniques that saved lives, and how diet itself became a weapon against brutal cold. Get comfortable, dim the lights around you, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away by this story that connects the past to the present in ways you never imagined. Imagine a world where winter wouldn't last just a few months, but would stretch across entire generations. We're not talking about science fiction or an apocalyptic scenario invented by screenwriters. We're talking about something that actually happened in human history, something as real as the air you're breathing right now. Between approximately 1300 and 1850, our planet experienced a period known as the Little Ice Age, a time when temperatures dropped significantly compared to previous centuries, creating climate conditions that challenged human survival in ways we rarely see documented in our history classes. To put this in perspective, average global temperatures fell between 0.5 and 1 degree Celsius, which might seem insignificant when you read a number on paper, when you see it on a graph on a screen, but which represented a monumental, almost apocalyptic change for the communities that lived during that period. Think about it, just 1 degree difference in average global temperature. Seems small, doesn't it? But when you multiply that by 550 years of continuous duration, when you consider that each winter was more severe than the last, when you imagine that crops failed with alarming frequency, that rivers froze at times of year when they would normally still flow with crystal clear and abundant water, that winters became so severe that entire groups of people disappeared in snowstorms that lasted for entire days, then suddenly that small number starts to make much more sense. Historians and climatologists who studied this period discovered fascinating evidence about how daily life was transformed. Ancient documents describe crops destroyed repeatedly, widespread famines that ravaged entire communities, and a sense of despair that permeated people's lives. But here's the most intriguing aspect. Despite all this adversity, despite conditions that should have led to the collapse of civilizations, people not only survived, they thrived, created, innovated, and developed solutions that still impress us today. But here's the question that should make us think deeply, a question you may have never considered before. How is it that entire civilizations not only survived this, but thrived? How did people without electric heaters, without synthetic clothes made in factories, without the ability to simply turn on a gas stove or light a fireplace with the click of a button, managed to keep themselves warm during winters that lasted 8, 9, sometimes 10 months? How did they feed their families when crops failed? How did they keep their children alive when the cold was so intense that the very air seemed to freeze in their lungs? The answer lies in an extraordinary combination of ingenuity, careful observation of nature, and a deep understanding of the basic principles of thermal physics. Even if they didn't call it that back then, they didn't have thermodynamics textbooks. They didn't have scientists in laboratories conducting experiments. What they had was necessity, creativity, and generations of accumulated knowledge that was passed from parents to children, from masters to apprentices, through oral traditions and practices that refined themselves with every winter that passed. The Little Ice Age was not an isolated event that affected only one region of the world, a small area that could be easily ignored by historians. It impacted communities from the Nordic regions of Scandinavia, where winters were already naturally severe, and became even more brutal, to the European Alps, where glaciers advanced over lands that were once cultivable, from the plains of Central Europe to the British Isles, where the temperate climate that characterized those regions transformed into something far more hostile. Each region developed its own strategies, its own solutions, its own methods of survival that were perfectly adapted to its local circumstances and available resources. And it's precisely this diversity of approaches that allows us to understand how human creativity flourishes precisely when circumstances are most challenging. When everything is comfortable, when we have easy access to everything we need, there's little motivation to innovate. But when survival is at stake, when each winter represents a real threat to your family's life, when you know you need to find a solution or face terrible consequences, it's in these circumstances that the human mind reaches its maximum potential for creativity. What makes this period particularly fascinating is that many of the solutions developed during the Little Ice Age weren't just temporary or improvised, created in the heat of the moment and discarded when the crisis passed. Some of them became a permanent part of the culture, architecture, and habits of communities. You can still see evidence of these adaptations in old European mansions, in construction techniques that persist to this day, in traditional recipes that have been passed down from generation to generation and are still prepared in family kitchens. These weren't temporary solutions, they were profound transformations in how people lived, built, and thought about the world around them. Think of the medieval architecture you may have seen in photographs or in films, those castles with tall towers and small windows, those houses with steep roofs that seem almost exaggerated, those deep basements that extend well below ground level. Each of these elements wasn't just a matter of aesthetics or the architect's preference. They were direct responses to the challenges imposed by extreme climate. Small windows retained heat. Steep roofs allowed snow to slide off rather than accumulate with its devastating weight. Deep basements maintained a constant temperature that allowed food to be stored throughout the winter. When we look at the modern world, we often wonder how our ancestors managed to live without the comforts we consider essential. We look at our heated homes, our cars with automatic heating, our clothes made of advanced synthetic materials, our ability to buy food from any part of the world at any time of year, and we think, how did they survive? But the truth is that they didn't just live. They created, built, innovated, and found beauty and meaning in their lives despite extreme difficulties. And perhaps, just perhaps, there's something we can learn from the resilience and creativity that characterized that era. In this video, we'll explore layer by layer how heat was generated, maintained, and shared. We'll discover how architecture transformed to retain heat in ways you never considered. We'll understand how clothing wasn't just a matter of fashion or personal expression, but of strategic survival. Each layer had a purpose. Each material was carefully chosen. And we'll see how even the food people ate was carefully selected to generate internal heat in the body, how nutrition became a heating tool. We'll explore isolation techniques that were developed before any formal scientific knowledge about thermal conductivity. We'll discover how communities shared warmth in ways that seem almost impossible to us, who are accustomed to privacy and personal space. We'll understand how domestic animals weren't just companions, but essential partners in the fight against the cold. And we'll see how the very social structure of communities reorganized itself to maximize everyone's chances of survival. But before we continue on this journey through the centuries, there's a question that should echo in your mind as you settle in for this story, as you allow yourself to relax and absorb this information. If people who lived 500 years ago without any of the technologies we consider indispensable today, without access to electricity, without formalized scientific knowledge, without the resources we have at our disposal, managed not only to survive but to thrive during one of the coldest periods. In modern history, what does that tell us about our own capacity for adaptation and resilience? What does it suggest about the strength of human creativity when we face real challenges? If you're enjoying diving into stories that reveal the fascinating secrets of how people lived in past eras, stories that connect the past to the present in unexpected ways, and that educate while you relax. Subscribe to our channel to receive notifications of news stories. We know our community is spread all over the world, from North America to Europe, through Latin America, Asia, Africa, and beyond. And it's absolutely fascinating for us to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Leave a comment telling us what city or country you're in, what time it is where you are, and if possible, what the weather is like where you're located. This connection with our global community is what motivates us to continue creating content that educates, relaxes, and inspires. We want to know if you're watching at night, if you're trying to fall asleep, if you're on a work break, or if you're simply seeking to learn something new. Each comment helps us better understand who you are and how we can create even more relevant and engaging stories. Now keep the lights off or dimmed, breathe deeply, and prepare to discover how cold, paradoxically, warmed human creativity in ways that still impress us centuries later. Prepare yourself to learn about solutions you never considered, about the ingenuity of people who didn't have access to the resources we have today, but who had something that may be even more valuable, the need to innovate and the determination to survive. When night fell during the Little Ice Age and temperatures plummeted to levels that seem almost unbelievable to us today, families faced a fundamental choice: how to stay alive until dawn. The answer wasn't in sophisticated technology or abundant resources. It was in something much simpler, much more primitive, but extraordinarily effective. It was in shared warmth. Imagine a typical medieval house during the harshest winter. There's no central heating, there are no radiators, there aren't even glass windows in many regions, just openings that let in the freezing air. The only real source of heat was fire, usually located in a central fireplace or stone stove. But here's the problem: a single fireplace, no matter how intensely it burned, couldn't heat an entire house. Heat dissipated quickly. Cold drafts found every opening and invaded the space, carrying away precious warmth. So, how did families solve this? They didn't try to heat the whole house. Instead, they concentrated on heating a single room, often the kitchen or main room where the fireplace was located. And during the coldest months, especially during the most severe nights, the entire family gathered in that space. Grandparents, parents, children, sometimes even domestic animals, all sharing the same space, the same warm air, the same body heat. This might seem uncomfortable to us, accustomed as we are to privacy and personal space, but there was brilliant scientific logic behind this practice. The human body is a heat-generating machine. A person at rest produces approximately 100 watts of heat. It's like having an incandescent light bulb turned on inside you. When you put several people together in an enclosed space, you're multiplying that heat production. 10 people in a small room generate 1,000 watts of body heat. That's significant. That's enough to make a real difference in room temperature. The historical documents that have survived to our day describe these scenes with almost poetic clarity. Entire families sleeping together in large wooden beds, often with heavy curtains around them to retain even more heat. Sometimes there were layers of people, grandparents, parents, and children, all sharing the same bed, their bodies touching, creating a network of heat that was distributed among everyone. It wasn't just a matter of comfort or emotional closeness, though certainly there were aspects of that. It was a carefully thought-out survival strategy. But shared warmth went beyond nuclear families. In many communities, especially in the coldest regions, there were entire social structures built around this need. People would gather in community buildings during the coldest nights. There were heat houses, structures specially designed to bring together as many people as possible in minimal space, maximizing collective body heat generation. These weren't luxury homes, they were functional structures, sometimes even primitive, but they were absolutely essential for survival. And there was another fascinating aspect of this dynamic. Sharing warmth created an interdependence that strengthened community bonds. You couldn't survive alone during harsh winters. You needed your family. You needed your community. This created a social structure where cooperation wasn't just encouraged. It was absolutely necessary to live. There was a shared responsibility for everyone's survival. Historians who studied records of communities that lived during the Little Ice Age noticed something interesting. There was much less social isolation during winters than at other times. People spent practically 24 hours together during the coldest months. They slept together, ate together, worked together on tasks that could be done inside the heated room. This constant proximity had profound psychological effects. There was less room for prolonged conflicts because you were literally sharing the same air with the person you disagreed with. But there was also a crucial practical matter that people of the time understood intuitively. The more people sharing the same space, the more efficient the use of firewood or coal for heating. If you had to heat 10 separate rooms, you'd need much more fuel. But if you concentrated the entire population in 1 or 2 rooms, you could use a fraction of the amount of fuel and still keep people alive and reasonably comfortable. This was an economic lesson that communities learned through bitter experience. In the early years of the Little Ice Age, when temperatures began to fall and people hadn't yet fully adapted, there were reports of families trying to keep their entire houses heated. They burned enormous quantities of firewood, exhausted their supplies long before spring arrived, and often didn't survive the last months of winter. But communities that learned to concentrate, to share space and warmth, that developed social structures around this need, these communities tended to survive. There was also an important emotional dimension to this sharing of warmth that is often overlooked by historians. Yes, it was a survival strategy, but it was also comforting. During a cold, dark night, when the wind howled outside and the cold was so intense you could hear it, an almost physical sound of ice forming, there was comfort in being surrounded by people you loved. There was security in feeling the warmth of bodies around you. There was a sense that together you would survive one more night. The records of diaries and letters from the time often mention this. People describing how they snuggled together, how they shared stories to distract themselves from the cold, how they sang together to keep morale high. It wasn't just physical survival, and it was also emotional and psychological survival. Shared warmth was as much about human connection as it was about thermoregulation, and there was an even more sophisticated aspect to this strategy that shows the level of strategic thinking communities developed. They understood that not all people generated the same amount of heat. Small children generated less heat than adults. The elderly, especially those who were more frail, also generated less. So there was careful organization of who slept where, how people were positioned. Small children were often placed between 2 adults so they could benefit from maximum possible heat. The elderly were positioned near the closest heat source. This wasn't accidental. This was the result of generations of observation and learning. Communities that survived were those that optimized every aspect of this heat-sharing dynamic. They developed unwritten rules about how to organize people, about who slept where, about how to ensure that the most vulnerable, children and the elderly, received maximum possible thermal protection. There's also evidence that people understood the importance of keeping people active during the day to generate more heat. It wasn't just for psychological reasons that families kept themselves busy with tasks. It was also because movement generates heat. A person in motion produces more heat than a person at rest. So during the day, people worked, moved around, performed tasks that kept them warm. At night, when movement was less possible, they gathered to share accumulated body heat. When we compare this with the modern world, it's interesting to note how our priorities have changed. We value privacy and personal space in ways that people of the Little Ice Age could never have imagined. We have homes with multiple rooms, each with its own heating. We sleep alone or only with our partners, in beds that are practically islands of privacy. This is comfortable, certainly, but there's something we've lost in this process. There's a disconnection, a lack of interdependence that characterized those communities. Of course, no one wants to go back to the days of sleeping in a bed with 10 other people without privacy, completely dependent on the community to survive. But perhaps there's a lesson here about the value of connection, about how shared need can create stronger bonds than anything we might experience in our modern, isolated lives. Shared warmth wasn't just a physical strategy, it was a philosophy of life. It was a deep understanding that survival was collective, not individual. And this understanding shaped not only how people kept warm, but how they lived, how they related to one another, how they built their communities. But while shared warmth was crucial for immediate survival during the coldest nights, there were other strategies that communities developed to deal with the cold during the day, during tasks that needed to be performed outside the shelter of the heated room. And these strategies were equally sophisticated, equally ingenious, and perhaps even more fascinating than the simple act of warming together. If shared warmth was the first line of defense against the cold during nights, clothing was the armor that people wore to face the outside world during the day. And when you start studying how people dressed during the Little Ice Age, you quickly realize that we're not talking about fashion, we're talking about sophisticated thermal engineering, an intuitive understanding of the principles of physics that govern heat transfer. The image we often have of medieval people is of individuals covered in heavy, awkward clothes, layers upon layers of fabric that seems suffocating. And yes, there were many layers, but each layer had a specific purpose, carefully thought out and refined over generations. It wasn't random, it wasn't just put on more clothes, it was a system. Let's start with the layer closest to the skin, the base layer. During the Little Ice Age, people wore underwear made of linen. Linen is a fascinating material from a thermal perspective. It absorbs moisture from the body without losing its insulating properties. This is crucial because moisture is one of the greatest enemies of body heat. If you're sweaty or wet, cold penetrates much more quickly. Linen solves this problem. It absorbs sweat, keeps it away from the skin, and at the same time retains body heat. But there was more. Over the linen shirt, people wore a second layer, often made of wool. Now, wool is where things get really interesting from a scientific perspective. Wool has a microscopic structure that creates small pockets of air. These air pockets are natural insulators. They retain body heat and create a barrier between you and the cold external environment. But there's more. Wool continues to retain heat even when it's wet. This is something people of the time understood intuitively, even without knowing the chemistry behind it. The third layer was often a coat or doublet, a heavier piece of clothing also made of wool or sometimes wool combined with other materials. This doublet had a dual purpose. Not only did it provide more insulation, but it also created a barrier against wind. Wind is one of the greatest thieves of heat. It removes the layer of warm air that your body naturally creates around itself. A well-fitted coat, especially one that was filled with materials like feathers or plant fibers, created a barrier against this wind. And then there were the outer layers, capes, heavy coats, sometimes made of leather or very dense fabric. These outer layers were mainly for protection against wind and moisture. They didn't provide as much insulation as the inner layers, but they were essential to keep wind and rain or snow away from the more delicate layers below. But here's where it gets truly sophisticated. People didn't just wear these layers. They understood how to adjust them according to conditions. If it was very cold and dry, they could wear all the layers. If it was a bit warmer, or if they were moving and generating more body heat, they could remove a layer. This flexibility was crucial to avoid overheating. which could lead to excessive perspiration and, consequently, rapid cooling when you stopped moving. Historical documents describe people who had an almost intuitive knowledge of how to manage these layers. There were unwritten rules. You didn't remove the base layer until you were completely sure you wouldn't need it. You didn't remove the wool layer until you were absolutely certain that the body heat generated by activity would be enough to keep you warm. This was accumulated knowledge passed from generation to generation, refined through bitter experience. And there was an even more ingenious aspect to this layering system, the way clothes were constructed. Sleeves weren't just tubes of fabric. They were designed to allow movement while retaining heat. Collars were high and tight, protecting the neck, which is one of the areas where the body loses heat most quickly. Pants were long and fitted at the ankles, often tied or fastened to prevent cold air from entering from below. There was also an important social dimension to clothing during this period. The quality of clothes you wore reflected your social position. The rich could wear better quality wool, finer fabrics that retained heat more efficiently. The poor often had to make do with lower quality clothes, rougher fabrics that didn't insulate as well. This meant that the poor suffered more from the cold, not just because they had fewer resources for heating in their homes, but also because their clothes were less effective. But even the poor developed strategies to deal with this. There were repair and patching techniques that allowed clothes to last longer. There were ways to add extra layers, wrapping cloth around the arms, tying fabric around the legs. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And it worked because people understood the basic principles of thermal insulation. A particularly fascinating aspect of clothing during the Little Ice Age was the role of accessories. Hats weren't just a matter of fashion. They were absolutely essential. The human body loses a disproportionate amount of heat through the head. A well-made hat, especially one made of wool or fur with the hair still intact, could make an enormous difference. There were hats with brims that protected the face from wind. There were hoods that could be pulled over the head in extreme conditions. Gloves were also crucial. Hands are extremities. They're far from the heart and the core of the body, so the body prioritizes warming the core over warming the extremities. This means that hands cooled very quickly. Well-made gloves, especially those made of wool or fur with the hair still intact, were absolutely essential. There were different types of gloves for different activities: thicker gloves for outdoor work, thinner gloves for tasks that required dexterity. And there were the feet, perhaps the most vulnerable part of the body when it comes to heat loss. People wore wool socks, often multiple layers. Shoes were made of leather or other dense materials that provided insulation. There were techniques for wrapping the feet with additional cloth, especially for long journeys in extreme cold. But there was an even more sophisticated aspect to this clothing system that shows the level of strategic thinking communities developed. They understood that clothing wasn't just about passive insulation, it was also about maintaining mobility and functionality. If you were so covered in clothes that you couldn't move, if you couldn't perform the tasks necessary to survive, then insulation didn't matter. So there was a careful balance between insulation and mobility. Clothes were designed to be warm but not so heavy that they prevented movement. There were ways to adjust layers quickly if you needed more mobility. There were techniques of tying and fastening that allowed you to control how clothes moved around your body. Historians who studied records of communities that lived during the Little Ice Age noticed something interesting. There was a large amount of practical knowledge about clothing that was transmitted through practice, not through written words. Mothers taught daughters how to sew clothes so they would retain more heat. Master craftsmen taught apprentices how to construct pieces of clothing that were both warm and functional. This knowledge was so valuable that it was carefully guarded, passed only to those who were considered worthy of learning it. And there was an important economic aspect to this system as well. Clothes were expensive. It took time to make them. It took resources to obtain them. so clothes were carefully maintained, repaired when necessary, passed from one person to another when someone grew or when someone died. A piece of clothing could last decades, being repaired and patched repeatedly. This meant that investing in good quality clothes was an investment in survival, not just your own, but that of future generations. When you think about it, it's remarkable how people of the Little Ice Age developed such a sophisticated clothing system without any formal knowledge of thermodynamics or physics. They didn't have books that explained why wool was better than cotton. They didn't have scientists who explained the principles of heat transfer. What they had was necessity, careful observation, and a willingness to experiment and learn from the results. If you're finding it fascinating how people developed these creative solutions to the challenges imposed by extreme cold, leave a comment below sharing which of these clothing techniques you find most impressive. We're building a community of people who appreciate historical ingenuity and human creativity, and your thoughts and perspectives are absolutely valuable to us. Furthermore, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, this is the perfect time to do so. Each subscription helps us continue creating stories that educate and relax simultaneously, stories that reveal the secrets of how people lived in past eras. And if you enable notifications, you'll be among the first to know when a new story is published, ensuring you don't miss any of these fascinating journeys through time. But while clothing was absolutely crucial for maintaining body heat during the day, there was another aspect of daily life that was equally important, perhaps even more important. For survival during the long and harsh winters of the Little Ice Age, there was something that people ate, something that they drank, something that they prepared carefully that wasn't just nutrition. It was fuel to generate internal heat. And the strategies they developed around diet and eating were as sophisticated as anything they did with their homes or their clothes. When you think about survival during a period of extreme cold, your mind probably goes to images of people warming themselves by fires, of isolated houses, of heavy clothes. But there's an aspect of survival that is often overlooked in historical accounts, an aspect that was absolutely fundamental to keeping people alive during the long winters of the Little Ice Age. Food. We're not just talking about eating for energy. We're talking about a carefully developed nutritional strategy, an intuitive understanding of how different foods affected the body's ability to generate and maintain heat. The human body is, in essence, a thermal machine. Everything you eat is converted into energy, and some of that energy is released as heat. But not all foods are equally efficient at generating that heat. People of the Little Ice Age understood this intuitively, even without knowing scientific terms like thermogenesis or thermic effect of food. They simply observed what worked and what didn't, and adjusted their diet accordingly. During the coldest months, the diet of communities that lived during the Little Ice Age changed dramatically compared to summer. In summer, there was a relative abundance of fresh food, vegetables, fruits, freshly harvested grains. But in winter, when harvests had ended and the cold made it impossible to grow anything, people depended on what they had stored during the warmer months. And here's the fascinating aspect. What they stored wasn't random. There was careful logic behind storage choices. People stored mainly grains, wheat, barley, rye, because grains were calorie-dense and could be stored for long periods without spoiling. But they also stored fat, butter, lard, oils. And here's the reason. Fat is the most calorie-dense food that exists. 1 gram of fat provides 9 calories, while 1 gram of carbohydrate provides only 4 calories. During winter, people ate much more fat than they did during summer. This wasn't a matter of preference or taste, it was a physiological necessity. The body needs more energy to maintain body temperature when it's cold, and fat provided that energy in concentrated form. A small amount of butter or lard could provide a significant amount of calories, which was crucial when food supplies were limited. But there was more than just calories involved in this eating strategy. There was also the question of how different foods affected the body's ability to retain heat. People of the time understood, again intuitively, that certain foods warmed the body more than others. Foods like meat, especially red meat, were considered hot, and there was a scientific reason for this. Protein has a high thermic effect. The body burns a significant amount of energy just to digest protein. This means that when you eat protein, your body generates more heat as a byproduct of the digestive process. So, during winter, people ate more meat than at other times of year. But here's the problem. Meat was expensive. Not everyone could afford to eat meat regularly. So there was a hierarchy of foods. The rich ate fresh meat, stored in cold cellars where it remained naturally frozen during winter. The poor ate dried or salted meat, preserved through preservation techniques that allowed meat to last months. And those who couldn't afford meat ate dried legumes, beans, lentils, which were also rich in protein and had a significant thermic effect. Historical documents describe winter meals that look very different from summer meals. In winter, there were broths and soups, often made with animal bones, which provided not only nutrients, but also heat. A bowl of hot broth wasn't just nutritious, it was also comforting, warming the body from the inside out. There were dense and heavy breads, often made with whole grains that provided more calories than more refined white breads. There were porridges and gruels made from grains, often cooked in milk or broth to add more calories. And there were hot drinks, teas made from herbs, drinks made with heated spices. Now here's something interesting. Spices weren't just for flavor. Many spices have thermogenic properties. They increase the body's metabolic rate, making it burn more calories and generate more heat. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves, pepper. All these spices were used not just because they made food more flavorful, but because they had a real physiological effect of warming the body. Records from monasteries during the Little Ice Age are particularly revealing about these eating strategies. Monks had access to written records about nutrition and health, knowledge that had been preserved since antiquity. They understood, in a much more formal way than the general population, how different foods affected the body. And their records show that during winter, they significantly increased their intake of foods rich in fat and protein, while reducing their intake of lighter foods and vegetables. But there was also an important psychological dimension to this eating strategy. Eating a warm and satisfying meal during a cold day wasn't just nutrition, it was also emotional comfort. It was a way of affirming that you had survived one more day, that there were enough resources to feed your family, that there was hope that you would survive the winter. Meals became important social events, moments when the community gathered, shared food and warmth, and reaffirmed their bonds. There were also sophisticated food storage techniques that allowed communities to maintain a relatively varied diet during winter. Roots and tubers were stored in dark, cold cellars where they remained fresh for months. Vegetables were preserved through fermentation, a process that not only preserved the food, but also created beneficial probiotics that helped with digestion. Fruits were dried or preserved in honey or syrup, and there was careful knowledge about when to eat what. People understood that at the beginning of winter, when supplies were abundant, they could be a bit more generous with portions. But as winter progressed and supplies dwindled, portions had to be reduced. There was an unwritten calendar of when certain foods should be consumed, when to finish the stored fresh meat, when to start relying more on dried and preserved foods, when to ration carefully to ensure there was something to eat until spring. Historians who studied records of communities that lived during the Little Ice Age noticed that there was a clear correlation between the quality of the eating strategy and the survival rate. Communities that understood the importance of storing foods rich in fat and protein that knew how to prepare meals that maximized the thermic effect of food, that had sophisticated storage and preservation systems. These communities tended to have lower mortality rates during the harshest winters. There was also a question of education and knowledge transmission. Mothers taught daughters how to prepare food in ways that maximized the heat generated by the body. Master cooks in noble mansions developed specific winter recipes that were different from summer recipes. There was accumulated practical knowledge about which combinations of foods worked best, which proportions of fat, protein, and carbohydrate provided the ideal balance to keep the body warm and healthy. A particularly fascinating aspect of this eating strategy was the role of beverages. Beyond hot tea and spiced drinks, there were also alcoholic beverages: wine, beer, mead. Now, alcohol is often considered as something that warms the body, and there's a reason for this. Alcohol increases the body's metabolic rate, making it burn more calories. But there's also a side effect. Alcohol causes vasodilation. It makes blood vessels expand, bringing more blood to the skin's surface. This creates the sensation of warmth, but actually causes greater loss of body heat to the environment. So, while a warm alcoholic drink could be comforting and could provide calories, it could also be dangerous if consumed in excess during extreme cold. Communities that understood this developed rules about when and how much alcohol was appropriate to consume during winter. There was traditional wisdom that said a small amount of hot wine or beer could be beneficial, but that drinking too much was dangerous. This wisdom was transmitted through stories, through proverbs, through community practices that discouraged excessive alcohol consumption during the coldest months. When you think about all this, about how people carefully planned their diets, about how they stored food, about how they intuitively understood the principles of nutrition and thermogenesis, you begin to realize that survival during the Little Ice Age wasn't a matter of luck. It was a matter of knowledge, of careful planning, of transmitting wisdom from generation to generation. And there was yet another crucial aspect of this eating strategy that communities developed. Something that had to do not just with what they ate, but with how they organized eating time, how they structured their meals, how they used food as a tool for social cohesion and psychological survival during the darkest and coldest months of the year. If you could travel back in time and visit a European village during the Little Ice Age, one of the first things you would notice would be how different the houses were from the houses you know today. Not just different in style or decoration, different in their fundamental structure, in how they were built, in how they were organized internally. Every detail, from the size of the windows to the slope of the roof, from the depth of the basement to the way internal divisions were arranged, all of this was a careful response to the challenges imposed by extreme cold. And when you start to understand these architectural innovations, you realize that people of the Little Ice Age were, in essence, sophisticated thermal engineers. Let's start with something you've probably already noticed in photographs of medieval mansions. The windows are small, very small. If you compare them with the large and generous windows of modern houses, medieval windows seem almost ridiculously small. But there was a very practical reason for this. Windows are one of the biggest points of heat loss in a house. They allow heat to escape and cold to enter. The smaller the window, the less heat is lost. Simple as that. But there was more than just size involved in this strategy. There was also the question of how windows were constructed. Many medieval houses didn't have glass. Glass was expensive and accessible only to the very rich. Instead, windows were covered with oiled paper, with parchment, or simply with wood that could be closed during the worst periods of winter. This meant that you could control how much light and air entered your house. During the coldest days, you simply closed the windows, creating an almost completely sealed environment. The rich who could afford glass often used glass in combination with other materials. There was double glazing, 2 layers of glass with air between them, a technique that provided much better insulation than single glass. There was also colored or opaque glass that reduced the amount of light entering, but which was less effective in terms of insulation. Knowledge about how to use glass to maximize thermal insulation was transmitted between builders and craftsmen, and it was valuable knowledge that could make a significant difference in a house's ability to retain heat. Now let's talk about roofs. If you look at photographs of old European mansions, you'll notice that roofs are often very steep, sometimes at an angle of 45 degrees or more. This wasn't a matter of aesthetics, it was a matter of survival. A steep roof allows snow to slide off rather than accumulate. Snow is an excellent insulator and it retains heat, but the weight of accumulated snow can damage the roof structure. So a steep roof was a way of maintaining the insulation of snow while avoiding the excessive weight that could cause the roof to collapse. There was also the question of how the roof was constructed internally. Many medieval roofs had a complex wooden structure that created air pockets. These air pockets functioned as insulation. There were also specific roofing materials that were chosen for their insulating properties. Clay tiles, for example, were more insulating than you might expect. Straw was an excellent insulator, although it was more flammable and required more maintenance. Slate was durable and offered protection against wind and rain, although it was less insulating. But perhaps the most important architectural innovation during the Little Ice Age was the way houses were organized internally. Most medieval houses had a structure very different from modern houses. Instead of multiple separate rooms, many houses had one large open space, the main hall, where most activities took place. There was a fireplace or stove in this central space, and the heat generated by the fire dispersed throughout the space. But as the Little Ice Age progressed and temperatures fell even further, people developed an important innovation. They began to divide their houses into smaller rooms. These smaller rooms were easier to heat. The heat from a single fireplace or stove could keep a small room reasonably warm. There was also a strategy of using only 1 or 2 rooms during winter, leaving the rest of the house practically unheated. This meant that you could concentrate your heating resources, your firewood, your coal, in a smaller and more manageable space. Houses also frequently had a basement, a structure that descended well below ground level. These basements served multiple purposes. First, they provided insulation. The soil around the basement was a natural insulator, keeping the space warmer than it would be above ground. Second, they provided a place to store food. The constant temperature of the basement, usually around 10–15 degrees Celsius, was ideal for preserving food during winter. Third, in some houses the basement was used as a living space during the worst periods of winter. People literally moved downstairs where it was warmer. There was also the question of how walls were constructed. Medieval walls were often very thick, sometimes more than a meter thick. This thickness provided insulation, but there was more than just insulation involved. Thick walls also provided thermal mass. They absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly during the night. This meant that a house with thick walls maintained a more constant temperature than a house with thin walls. The materials used in walls were also important. Stone was a popular building material because it was durable and provided good thermal mass. But there were also construction techniques that maximized the insulating properties of stone. There was a technique called cavity construction, where there was a space between the outer and inner layers of stone. This space was often filled with materials like straw, moss, or other natural insulators. This technique created an air barrier that provided additional insulation. Historical documents describe houses that were built with meticulous attention to insulation details. There were records of master builders who specialized in construction for cold climates. They understood the principles of heat transfer, even if they didn't use those terms. They knew where to place windows to minimize heat loss while still allowing some natural light. They knew how to build roofs that were both insulating and structurally sound. They knew how to organize rooms to maximize heating efficiency. There were also innovations in heating systems. The traditional fireplace was efficient at creating heat, but inefficient at distributing that heat. Much of the heat simply went up the chimney and escaped into the atmosphere. So, people developed innovations to capture more of that heat. There were fireplaces with special chambers that captured heat and distributed it throughout the house. There were mass stoves, large structures made of stone or clay that absorbed heat from the fireplace and released it slowly. There were also duct systems that channeled heat from one fireplace to multiple rooms. A particularly fascinating aspect of these innovations was how they were adapted to local circumstances. In regions where there was an abundance of stone, houses were built with very thick stone walls. In regions where there was an abundance of wood, houses were built with wooden frame structures, often with clay and straw filling that provided insulation. In regions where there was little building material available, people developed construction techniques that maximize the use of local materials. Records from different regions show a remarkable diversity of architectural solutions. In Scandinavia, where the cold was particularly severe, houses were often built with very heavy wooden frames and insulation of moss or straw. In the Alps, where there was an abundance of stone, houses were built with extremely thick stone walls. In the plains of Central Europe, houses often had very deep basements that provided additional insulation. But there was also an important social aspect to these architectural innovations. The way a house was built reflected the social position of its owner. The rich could afford houses with multiple rooms, with glass in the windows, with sophisticated heating systems. The poor often lived in much simpler houses and sometimes just one or two rooms with small windows or no windows with minimal heating. This meant that the rich had a significant advantage in terms of comfort and survival during harsh winters. But even the poor developed strategies to improve the insulation of their houses with the resources they had available. There were caulking techniques, filling cracks in walls with moss, straw, or other insulating materials. There were lining techniques, covering interior walls with cloth or paper to reduce drafts. There were window blocking techniques, using wood or paper to block windows during the worst periods of winter. Historians who studied the architectural structures that survived from the Little Ice Age noticed something fascinating. Many of these innovations were so effective that they are still used today. The insulation principles that people developed 500 years ago are still relevant. The construction techniques they refined are still taught to modern builders. The concepts of thermal mass, cavity insulation, moisture control, all these concepts that were developed empirically during the Little Ice Age are now part of the formal science of construction. And there's something profoundly human in recognizing that people who lived centuries ago, without access to any formal scientific knowledge, managed to develop solutions that are still effective today. They observed, experimented, refined their techniques, and transmitted their knowledge to the next generation. Each generation added its own innovations, refined the techniques they had inherited, and left a legacy of knowledge for those who would come after. If you're fascinated by how people develop these creative solutions to the challenges imposed by extreme cold, consider leaving a comment sharing which of these architectural innovations you find most impressive or creative. We'd love to know what you think about how people manage to be so ingenious without modern technology. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is the perfect time to do so and ensure you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that explore the fascinating secrets of how people lived in past eras. Enable notifications to be among the first to know when a new story is published. But while architecture provided the physical shelter and insulation necessary to survive the cold, there was still another crucial aspect of life during the Little Ice Age that people had to navigate. something that had to do with the very structure of time, with how they organized their days and nights, with how they used light and darkness as tools for survival. When you live in a modern world, you probably don't think much about how time is organized. You wake up when your alarm goes off, you work during specific hours, you sleep on a more or less consistent schedule. Your life is structured by clocks, by calendars, by social conventions that dictate when you should do what. But during the Little Ice Age, time wasn't organized that way. Time was organized according to the needs of survival, according to the cold, according to the availability of light and heat. The most dramatic change in the organization of time during the Little Ice Age had to do with light. During the winter months, especially in regions further north, there was very little natural light. Days were short. In some regions, there were only a few hours of light between sunrise and sunset. This meant that most of daily life happened in darkness or in constant twilight that was only slightly better than total darkness. Now you might think that people simply slept more during winter, that they retreated to their homes and slept during the coldest months. And there's some truth to that, and there was definitely more sleep during winter, but the reality was more complex. People still needed to work, still needed to perform essential tasks for survival. So they developed strategies to deal with the lack of light. The first strategy was to maximize the use of natural light that was available. People woke up early before dawn to prepare for the day. They left their homes as soon as there was enough light to see and worked as much as possible during the hours of daylight. They concentrated their most important tasks, those that required clear vision, during midday when there was the maximum amount of natural light. As the afternoon advanced and light decreased, they switched to tasks that required less vision, tasks that could be done in twilight or that could be done mainly by touch and muscle memory. There was also a strategy of maximizing reflected light. The interior walls of houses were often painted in light colors, white, cream, pale tones, to reflect the maximum amount of light possible. Windows, small as they were kept clean to allow the maximum amount of light to enter. There was also the use of mirrors, a luxury that only the rich could afford, to reflect natural light into homes. But when night fell, and during winter night fell very early, people needed artificial light. The most common source of artificial light was the candle, but candles were expensive. They were made from tallow, animal fat, or beeswax, both being valuable resources. So candles weren't used generously, they were used sparingly, only when absolutely necessary. There was a hierarchy of lighting at night. The rich, who could afford beeswax candles, had well-lit homes. The poor who couldn't afford candles often lived in near total darkness at night, or used oil lamps, containers with oil and a wick, that provided much dimmer light than candles. But there was an important consequence of this lack of artificial light. People slept more during winter. It wasn't just a matter of choice, it was a matter of necessity. When it got dark, there wasn't much to do. You couldn't work. You couldn't engage in activities that required vision. So you slept. And this sleep wasn't necessarily continuous sleep. There was evidence that people slept in 2 periods during the night, with a period of wakefulness between them, during which they performed light tasks or simply conversed. This biphasic sleep pattern, 2 periods of sleep separated by a period of wakefulness, was so common during the Little Ice Age that it had names for it in various languages. In English, it was called first sleep and second sleep. There was a cultural acceptance that this was the normal pattern of sleep during winter. People didn't see this as insomnia or as a problem. It was simply how people slept. But there was more than just sleep involved in this reorganization of time. There was also a reorganization of when tasks were performed. Many tasks that were done during the day in summer were deferred to winter, when there was more time available. There were craft tasks, weaving, sewing, woodworking, that were done mainly during winter when there was less agricultural work to do. There were also maintenance tasks, repairing tools, mending clothes, preparing materials for the next season, that were done during winter. Historical documents describe a much more sedentary life during winter. People spent most of their time indoors performing tasks that could be done in enclosed spaces. There was a different rhythm to life, a rhythm that was slower, more contemplative, more focused on tasks that required concentration and skill rather than tasks that required vigorous physical movement. There was also an important social dimension to this reorganization of time. During winter, when people spent most of their time indoors gathered in small, heated spaces, there was more time for social interaction. There was time for storytelling, for transmitting knowledge, for strengthening community bonds. There was time for education, parents teaching children, masters teaching apprentices. There was time for cultural activities, music, dance, games. Records of communities during the Little Ice Age frequently mention parties and celebrations during winter. These weren't just diversions. They were also a way of keeping morale high during a time that could be depressing. There were parties at the winter solstice, religious celebrations, special occasions that broke the monotony of winter and provided something to look forward to. There was also a reorganization of when meals were consumed. During summer, when there was agricultural work to do, people often ate light meals during the day: bread, cheese, fruit, and a more substantial meal at night. But during winter, when there was less work to do during the day, the pattern of meals often changed. There was a substantial meal in the middle of the day, when there was more natural light, and a lighter meal at night. Or, in some communities, there was only 1 or 2 meals a day during winter, instead of the 3 meals there might be during summer. This reorganization of when meals were consumed wasn't just a matter of convenience. It had real physiological implications. Eating a substantial meal during the day, when there was more light and more activity, meant that the body had more time to digest the food and generate heat from digestion. Eating a light meal at night meant that the body didn't have to work as hard during the night to digest food, allowing more energy to maintain body temperature. There was also a question of how work was organized during winter. Many tasks that required multiple people, such as construction, repair of large structures, agricultural work, were deferred to spring and summer. But there were tasks that could be done during winter, often in groups. There were community tasks, repairing paths, maintaining community structures, preparing materials for the next season, that were done collaboratively. This collaboration had multiple benefits. First, it allowed tasks to be completed more quickly. Second, it provided opportunities for people to gather to strengthen community bonds. Third, it allowed knowledge to be transmitted, masters teaching apprentices, more experienced people sharing their skills with less experienced people. Historians noted that there was a much more communal structure to life during winter. People weren't isolated in their individual homes. There was a significant amount of community interaction, collaborative work, shared celebrations. This had important implications for psychological survival during a time that could be very depressing. There was also a question of how time was measured and understood. Modern people measure time in hours, in minutes, in seconds. But during the Little Ice Age, time was often measured in terms of natural events: sunrise and sunset, phases of the moon, seasons. There was a cyclical understanding of time, rather than a linear understanding. Winter was a season that returned each year, with its own rhythms and patterns. This cyclical understanding of time had important implications for how people planned and prepared for winter. They knew that winter would arrive, that it would last a certain period of time, and that spring would eventually return. This predictability provided a sense of control, even in circumstances that were fundamentally beyond human control. There was also a question of how knowledge about time was transmitted. There were calendars, some written, some just memorized, that tracked the seasons, that indicated when certain events would happen. There was traditional wisdom about natural signs that indicated changes in seasons. There was understanding of weather patterns that repeated year after year. Historical documents show that people developed a sophisticated understanding of how time worked, of how seasons changed, of how cold and heat alternated. This understanding allowed them to prepare adequately for winter, to store sufficient resources, to organize their lives in ways that maximize their chances of survival. When you think about all this, about how people completely reorganized their lives during winter, about how they changed their sleep patterns, their work schedules, their meal patterns, their social structures, you realize that survival during the Little Ice Age wasn't just a matter of technology or physical resources. It was also a matter of how people understood and related to time, to seasons, to the natural rhythms of the world around them. And there was still another crucial aspect of this adaptation to extreme cold that communities developed. Something that had to do not just with how they organized their time, but with how they organized their communities, with how they structured their societies to maximize the chances of collective survival. When you think about survival during periods of extreme crisis, it's easy to imagine isolated individuals or families struggling alone against adversity. But the reality of the Little Ice Age was very different. The truth is that the people who survived, and not just survived but thrived, were those who understood that survival was fundamentally a collective matter. The social and community structures that communities developed during this period were as important to survival as clothing, architecture, or strategic eating. Let's start with the basic unit of society during the Little Ice Age: the extended family. Unlike modern families, which often consist only of parents and children, families during this period were much larger and more complex structures. A family could include grandparents, parents, children, uncles, aunts, cousins, and sometimes even unrelated people who lived under the same roof. This extended family structure wasn't just a matter of preference or tradition, it was a carefully thought-out survival strategy. Why? Because the more people lived together, the more resources could be shared, the more efficiently heat could be used, the more knowledge could be transmitted. An extended family had multiple generations living together, which meant there were people with different skills, different knowledge, different abilities. The elderly had experience. They had survived previous winters and knew which strategies worked. Adults of working age had strength and work capacity. Children, although they required resources, also represented the future of the family and community. This extended family structure created a network of interdependence. No one could survive alone. You needed your family to survive. And this need created bonds much stronger than anything we could experience in our modern societies, where independence is valued above all else. But the extended family wasn't the only important social unit. There was also the village and the community of families that lived close to one another. And the village had its own structures, its own rules, its own ways of ensuring that everyone survived. One of the most important structures was the system of resource sharing. During winter, when resources were scarce, there was a community understanding that resources should be shared in a way that ensured everyone's survival. If one family had more firewood than it needed, it would share with a family that had less. If one family had more food, it would share with a family that was going hungry. This wasn't charity, it was a matter of mutual survival. Historical documents describe formal systems of resource sharing. There were community granaries where surplus harvest was stored during summer and from which families could withdraw during winter if their own supplies ran out. There were systems of mutual aid where families committed to helping one another in times of need. There were rules about how much each family could withdraw from the community granary to ensure there was enough for everyone. There was also a question of justice and equity involved in these community structures. If one family was suffering while others had abundance, there was social pressure, and sometimes even legal pressure, to share. There were punishments for those who refused to share, who accumulated resources while others suffered. These punishments could be severe, from social ostracism to confiscation of goods. But there was also rational logic behind this emphasis on sharing. Communities understood that if one family starved to death during winter, it weakened the entire community. If someone died of cold, it meant fewer hands to work in spring. If children died, it meant fewer people for the next generation. So, ensuring that everyone survived was ensuring the survival of the community as a whole. There were also community leadership structures that were responsible for ensuring that resources were managed appropriately. There were elders, older people, who were respected for their experience and wisdom, who made decisions about how community resources should be distributed. There were also masters, people who had specialized skills in areas such as construction, cooking, medicine, who were responsible for transmitting their skills to the next generation. These leadership structures weren't necessarily formal or written. Often they were based on tradition and tacit consent, but they were real structures that had real power to influence people's behavior and to ensure that the community functioned coherently. There was also a question of specialization within the community. Not everyone did the same thing. There were people who specialized in different skills. Some were carpenters, some were weavers, some were healers, some were farmers. This specialization created even greater interdependence. You needed the carpenter to repair your house, you needed the weaver to make your clothes, you needed the healer to care for you when you were sick. And in return, you provided your own specialized skills to the community. This specialization also had implications for how knowledge was transmitted. Specialized knowledge, how to be a carpenter, how to be a weaver, was often transmitted through a formal apprenticeship system. A young person would be placed as an apprentice with a master and would spend years learning the skill. This system ensured that specialized knowledge was preserved and transmitted to the next generation. There was also a question of how community tasks were organized. There were tasks that benefited the entire community: maintenance of paths, repair of community structures, protection against external threats. These tasks were often organized collaboratively, with community members working together to complete them. There was a system of mandatory work where each person was expected to contribute a certain number of days of work per year to community projects. Historical documents describe these occasions of community work with fascinating detail. There was a sense of celebration and camaraderie associated with these tasks. People worked together, but there was also time for socializing, for sharing food, for strengthening community bonds. These occasions of community work were as much about building physical structures as they were about building social structures. There was also a question of how disputes were resolved within the community. When two people had a conflict, there were community mechanisms to resolve the dispute in a way that wouldn't harm the entire community. There were mediators, respected people who could help the conflicting parties reach an agreement. There was also a system of community justice where violations of community norms were punished in a way that was considered fair by the community. These conflict resolution structures were important because unresolved conflicts could lead to divisions within the community, and a divided community was a weak community. So, there was strong pressure to resolve conflicts quickly and in a way that was acceptable to everyone involved. There was also an important spiritual and religious dimension to community structures during the Little Ice Age. The Christian Church was a unifying force in many communities. There were religious celebrations that brought the entire community together, that reaffirmed shared values, that provided hope during difficult times. There were also religious teachings about charity, about sharing, about caring for the needy, that provided moral justification for resource-sharing structures. Historical documents show that the church often played an important role in ensuring that resources were shared. There were tithes, a percentage of resources that was given to the church, which was then redistributed to the poor and needy. There were also hospices maintained by the church where travelers and people in need could find shelter and food. But there was also a question of how communities dealt with those who couldn't contribute: the elderly, the disabled, orphaned children. In a modern society, these people might be left to die or depend on government assistance. But in communities, during the Little Ice Age, there was a community responsibility to care for them. There was an understanding that everyone had value, that everyone deserved to be cared for, that the community as a whole was responsible for the well-being of all its members. This doesn't mean that life was easy for those who couldn't work. Often it was very difficult, but there was at least recognition that they had a right to a minimum level of care and sustenance. And this community responsibility was one of the things that distinguished communities that survived from those that didn't. There was also a question of how communities prepared for winter. It wasn't just a matter of individuals or families preparing. There was coordinated community preparation. There were community decisions about how much of each type of resource should be stored. There were community inspections of houses to ensure they were adequately prepared for winter. There was community planning about how resources would be distributed during winter. This coordinated community preparation was possible because there were leadership and communication structures that allowed the community to function as a coherent unit. There were community meetings where decisions were made. There were people responsible for different aspects of preparation. Someone responsible for ensuring there was enough firewood, someone responsible for ensuring there was enough food, someone responsible for ensuring houses were adequately prepared. When you think about all this, about how communities organized themselves, about how they shared resources, about how they collectively prepared for winter, you realize that the Little Ice Age created a type of society that was fundamentally different from modern society. It was a society where the community was more important than the individual, where collective survival was more important than individual gain, where there was shared responsibility for everyone's well-being. If you're appreciating how these community structures worked and how they allowed communities to survive extreme challenges, leave a comment sharing your thoughts about what you find most valuable in these structures, whether it's resource sharing, specialization of skills, or shared community responsibility. We'd love to hear your perspective on how these historical lessons could be relevant to our modern communities. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, this is an excellent time to do so, and ensure you receive notifications of all our upcoming stories. Each subscription motivates us to continue exploring these fascinating aspects of how people lived in past eras. But while community structures provided the social foundation for survival, there was still another crucial aspect that communities had to navigate. Something that had to do with the very health of people, with how they maintained their body's health during a period when disease was rampant and when access to medical care was extremely limited. When you live in a modern world with access to antibiotics, advanced surgery, hospitals equipped with sophisticated technology, it's easy to forget what life was like when medicine was practically non-existent. During the Little Ice Age, when people faced extreme cold, frequent malnutrition, and living conditions that were often unsanitary, health was a matter of life and death. And the strategies that communities developed to maintain health, or at least to minimize death, reveal a sophisticated understanding of the human body and how to keep it functioning in extremely adverse circumstances. Let's start with an uncomfortable reality. During the Little Ice Age, the mortality rate was high, very high. People died from diseases that today would be easily treatable. They died from infections that started with small wounds. They died from malnutrition. They died from cold. They died from complications of childbirth. They died from diseases that spread rapidly through densely crowded communities. But despite this grim reality, there was also a growing understanding of how to keep people alive. There were practices that worked, even if people didn't fully understand why. There were remedies that helped, even if they were based on empirical observation rather than formal scientific knowledge. And there was careful transmission of this knowledge from generation to generation. One of the most important practices for maintaining health during winter was hygiene. Now, you might think that people of the Little Ice Age were dirty, that they didn't care about cleanliness, but the reality was more nuanced. There was an understanding that cleanliness was important for health, even if there was no formal understanding of germs or bacteria. Historical documents describe bathing practices that were more frequent than you might expect. There were public baths in many cities, structures where people could wash themselves. There were also personal cleaning practices that were considered important. Hands were washed before eating, faces were washed regularly, clothes were washed when possible, although the frequency depended on the availability of hot water and time. There was also an understanding that certain types of dirt were more dangerous than others. There was a distinction between common dirt and dirt that was associated with disease. People avoided contact with those who were sick. There were isolation practices. Sick people were often kept separate from the rest of the community to prevent the spread of disease. But there was more than just hygiene involved in maintaining health. There was also a question of nutrition. During winter, when food was often monotonous and limited, there was a real risk of malnutrition. People understood intuitively that certain foods were important for health. There was a valuation of foods that provided strength: meat, eggs, milk. There was also a valuation of foods that provided color: vegetables and fruits, even if there was no formal understanding of vitamins. Historical documents describe food storage practices that were designed not just to preserve food, but also to preserve its nutrients. There were fermentation techniques that increased the availability of certain nutrients. There were drying techniques that preserved fruits and vegetables so they could be consumed during winter. There was also an understanding that certain foods, such as fat-rich foods, were particularly important during winter. There was also a question of exercise and movement. Although people spent much time indoors during winter, there was an understanding that movement was important for health. There were exercise practices, dancing, games, work, that kept people active. There was also an understanding that movement generated heat, which was important for survival during extreme cold. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medicine during the Little Ice Age was the use of medicinal plants. Communities had extensive knowledge of plants that could be used to treat diseases and wounds. There were plants that reduced fever. There were plants that helped with digestion. There were plants that had anti-inflammatory properties. There were plants that helped with wound healing. This knowledge of medicinal plants was often transmitted through women. There were healers, or midwives, who had specialized knowledge of medicinal plants and how to use them. This knowledge was valuable and was carefully guarded. There were specific recipes for different diseases, specific techniques for preparing plants, knowledge about when to harvest plants to maximize their medicinal properties. Historical documents describe detailed recipes for remedies made from plants. There were teas made from herbs that were used to treat colds and cough. There were ointments made from plants that were applied to wounds to prevent infection. There were drinks made from plants that were used to treat digestive problems. There were even practices of bloodletting, removing blood from the body, which was believed to help various conditions, although we now know this was often harmful. There was also an understanding that certain foods had medicinal properties. Garlic was valued for its anti-inflammatory and antibacterial properties. Honey was used to treat wounds and to help with cough. Ginger was used to treat nausea and to warm the body. These practices were based on empirical observation, but many of them now have scientific validation. A particularly important aspect of medicine during the Little Ice Age was the treatment of wounds. Wounds could easily become infected and lead to death. So there were careful practices for treating wounds. There was cleaning with hot water. There was application of medicinal ointments. There were bandages that were kept clean. There was also an understanding that certain wounds needed to be left open to drain, a practice that, although not always effective, sometimes worked. There was also a question of how to deal with infectious diseases that spread rapidly through communities. There were quarantine practices, isolating sick people to prevent the spread of disease. There were also disinfection practices, burning certain materials, using smoke or vapors to purify the air. These practices were often based on superstition, but sometimes had real effects. Historical documents describe epidemics of diseases such as plague, typhus, and other infectious diseases that swept through communities during the Little Ice Age. These epidemics were devastating, often killing a significant percentage of the population, but there was also a growing understanding of how to limit the spread of these diseases. There was isolation of sick people. There was cleaning of houses where people had died. There were even quarantines of entire cities to prevent the spread of disease to other regions. There was also a question of mental health. The long, dark winter, the extreme cold, the constant threat of death. All of this had significant psychological effects. There was depression, there was anxiety, there was a sense of despair that could be debilitating. Communities developed strategies to deal with this. There were celebrations and parties that provided moments of joy and hope. There were spiritual and religious practices that provided comfort and meaning. There was also a sense of community that provided emotional support during difficult times. Historical documents describe healing practices that were both psychological and physical. There were rituals that were performed to help sick people. There were prayers and blessings. There were also practices of therapeutic touch. The simple act of someone placing a hand on you, of offering physical comfort, had real effects on health. There was also a question of how communities dealt with people who had disabilities or chronic diseases. These people often couldn't work, couldn't contribute productively to the community, but there was a community responsibility to care for them. There were people who were designated to care for the sick. There were community resources that were allocated to provide care. There was an understanding that everyone had value, even if they couldn't work. A particularly fascinating aspect of medicine during the Little Ice Age was the understanding that certain environments were healthier than others. There was a preference for houses with good ventilation, even if it meant letting in the cold. There was an understanding that excessive humidity was harmful to health. There was also an understanding that certain locations, near swamps or stagnant water, were less healthy than others. This understanding led to building practices that favored health. There were houses built on elevated locations to avoid humidity. There were drainage systems to direct water away. There were openings for ventilation, even if it meant letting in some cold. These practices were based on empirical observation, but often worked. There was also a question of how pregnant women and newborns were cared for. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women died during childbirth, and many babies died shortly after birth. But there were practices that helped. There were experienced midwives who had knowledge of how to facilitate childbirth. There were herbs that were used to reduce pain and to help with contractions. There were hygiene practices that reduced the risk of infection. There was also an understanding that rest and proper nutrition after childbirth were important for recovery. Historical documents show that there was careful transmission of this knowledge from experienced midwives to younger midwives. There were specific techniques that were taught. There was knowledge about when to intervene and when to let the natural process occur. There was also an understanding that not all births could be saved, that sometimes death was inevitable, but that there were things that could be done to maximize the chances of survival. When you think about all this, about how communities maintained health in extremely adverse circumstances, about how they developed practices that worked even without formal scientific understanding, about how they transmitted this knowledge from generation to generation, but you realize that there was real sophistication in medicine during the Little Ice Age. It wasn't modern medicine, certainly, There were many practices that we now know to be ineffective or harmful, but there were also many practices that worked, that were based on careful observation and experimentation, and that saved lives. And there was still another crucial aspect of life during the Little Ice Age that communities had to navigate. Something that had to do with how they prepared themselves psychologically for winter, with how they maintained hope and morale during a time that could be profoundly depressing. There's an aspect of survival during the Little Ice Age that is often overlooked by historians, an aspect that was perhaps as important as clothing, food, or architecture. It was the ability to maintain hope, to maintain the will to live, to find meaning and joy in circumstances that could easily lead to total despair. It was, in essence, the psychological and spiritual survival that allowed people to survive physically. Imagine living in a world where winter lasts 8, 9, sometimes 10 months. Imagine the constant darkness, the cold that penetrates every aspect of your life, the constant threat of death from cold, hunger, or disease. Imagine knowing that you might not survive until spring, that your family might not survive, that the people you love might die during the night. That was the psychological reality of life during the Little Ice Age. Under these circumstances, it would be understandable if people simply gave up, if they fell into total despair, if they lost the will to live. And there is evidence that some people really did this. There were suicides during the harshest winters. There were people who simply surrendered to the cold, who stopped fighting for survival. But most people didn't do this. Most people found ways to maintain hope, to find meaning, to continue living despite extreme adversities. One of the most important ways to do this was through religion and spirituality. The Christian Church provided a framework for understanding suffering. Winter was seen not just as a physical challenge, but as a spiritual test. It was an opportunity to demonstrate faith, to draw closer to God, to gain spiritual merit through suffering. This reinterpretation of suffering, transforming it from something merely negative into something that had spiritual meaning, was a powerful psychological strategy. Historical documents describe religious practices that were particularly intense during winter. There were more prayers, more religious celebrations, more emphasis on virtues such as patience, resignation, and faith. There were also promises of reward, in the belief that those who survived winter with faith and virtue would be rewarded in heaven. This promise of future reward provided a reason to continue living, a reason to maintain hope. But there were also more practical aspects of religion that helped with psychological survival. There were religious celebrations that brought the community together, that provided moments of joy and connection. There was Christmas, which was celebrated even during the harshest winter, which provided a reason to celebrate, to share food, to gather with family and community. There was also Easter, although it was at the end of winter, which provided hope that spring was coming, that winter would soon end. There were also spiritual practices that were less formal, less connected to the institutional church. There were beliefs in spirits, in magic, in supernatural forces that could be appeased or manipulated. There were rituals that were performed to bring good luck, to ward off evil, to ensure survival. These practices were often condemned by the official church, but persisted because they provided real psychological comfort. Beyond religion, there was also the question of how communities created moments of joy and celebration during winter. There were parties and celebrations that broke the monotony of winter. There were songs that were sung together. There were dances that were performed. There were games that were played. There were stories that were told, stories of heroes, of adventures, of better times. Historical documents describe these occasions of celebration with details that reveal their importance. There was careful preparation. Special food was prepared. Drinks were heated. The space was decorated. There was a sense of anticipation. People looked forward to these occasions, planned for them, anticipated them with enthusiasm, and when they arrived, there was an explosion of joy. People danced, laughed, sang, temporarily forgetting the cold and fear that characterized their lives. These celebrations weren't just entertainment. They were a way of maintaining psychological health, of maintaining hope, of reaffirming community bonds. They provided something to look forward to, a reason to continue living, an affirmation that life had value and meaning even in extremely adverse circumstances. There was also the question of how stories and narratives were used to maintain hope. There were stories of people who had survived even harsher winters before. There were stories of communities that had faced even greater challenges. There were stories of heroes who had overcome impossible adversities. These stories provided models of how to survive, of how to maintain hope, of how to find meaning in suffering. Historical documents show that there was careful transmission of these stories. They were told during winter when there was time for storytelling. They were told by older people to younger people, transmitting not just the story itself but also the lessons it contained. These stories became part of the community's cultural identity, a way of keeping alive the memory of how people had survived in the past. There was also a question of how people found meaning in their daily lives. Even during winter, when there was less agricultural work to do, there were tasks that needed to be performed. There were clothes that needed to be sewn, tools that needed to be repaired, houses that needed to be maintained. These tasks provided a sense of purpose, a reason to continue living, a way to contribute to the community. Historical documents describe how people found satisfaction in these tasks. There was a sense of craftsmanship, of doing something well, of creating something that was useful or beautiful. There was a sense of contribution, of knowing that you were helping your family and community survive. There was also a sense of continuity, of knowing that you were doing the same things your ancestors had done, that you were participating in a tradition that extended through the centuries. There was also the question of how people dealt with grief and loss. During winter, when death was frequent, there was a need to process loss, to honor the dead, to continue living despite the pain. There were funeral rituals that allowed the community to gather to honor the dead, to reaffirm the bonds between the living. There were also mourning practices that were considered appropriate, periods of time during which people were expected to demonstrate their sadness in specific ways, but there was also an understanding that mourning couldn't last forever, that life had to continue. There was a point after which people were expected to return to their normal activities, to return to work, to return to community life. This transition from mourning to normal life was important for psychological survival. It provided a signal that life continued, that there was reason to continue living. There was also a question of how communities dealt with fear. Fear of the cold, fear of hunger, fear of death. These fears were constant during winter, but there were practices that helped deal with fear. There were breathing and meditation techniques that were taught, although they weren't called by those names. There were visualization practices, imagining yourself in warm places, in better times. There were also action practices, i.e. doing something to prepare for winter, to increase the chances of survival, which provided a sense of control and agency. Historical documents describe how people developed a kind of psychological resilience, an ability to deal with extreme adversities without falling into total despair. This resilience was developed through experience, through transmission of knowledge, through practices that were refined over generations. There was an understanding that winter was a challenge, but a challenge that could be faced, that could be overcome. There was also a question of how people maintained a sense of identity and purpose during winter. They weren't just survivors. They were members of a community. They were bearers of a tradition. They were participants in a story that extended through the centuries. This identity and purpose provided a reason to continue living, a reason to maintain hope. A particularly fascinating aspect of psychological survival during the Little Ice Age was how people found beauty and joy in simple things. There was appreciation for the beauty of nature, for the way snow glittered in the light, for the way ice formed in complex patterns, for the way the night sky was filled with stars. There was appreciation for simple moments. A warm meal shared with family, the warmth of being close to other people, the sound of music or a story. Historical documents contain poetic descriptions of how people saw the world around them, even during the most difficult times. There was a sense that despite the cold and suffering, there was still beauty and meaning in life. There was an ability to find joy in small things, to appreciate what was available, to not allow oneself to be completely consumed by despair. When you think about all this, think about how people maintained hope, about how they found meaning and joy in extremely adverse circumstances, about how they developed psychological resilience that allowed them to continue living, you realize that survival during the Little Ice Age wasn't just a matter of physical resources or technology. It was also a matter of psychological strength, of faith, of community, of the ability to find meaning and purpose, even in times of great suffering. And there was still one final crucial aspect of life during the Little Ice Age that communities had to navigate. Something that had to do with how they prepared for the future, with how they ensured that the knowledge they had developed would be transmitted to the next generation, with how they built a foundation for continued survival. If you could talk to a person who lived during the Little Ice Age and ask them what was the most important thing they could leave for their children, they probably wouldn't say money or property. Although those things were valuable, they would probably say knowledge. Because during the Little Ice Age, knowledge was literally the difference between life and death. Knowledge of how to dress for the cold, of how to store food, of how to build a house that retained heat, of how to cure diseases. This knowledge was more valuable than gold, and that's why communities that survived the Little Ice Age developed sophisticated systems of knowledge transmission. They weren't formal systems, they weren't written in books, although there were some written records. They were systems that worked through practice, through observation, through narrative, through careful transmission from generation to generation. Let's start with the education of children. During the Little Ice Age, there were no schools in the modern sense. There were no professional teachers teaching in classrooms, but there was education, and this education was rigorous, it was practical, it was focused on skills that were necessary for survival. Education began early. Small children learned by observing their parents. They saw how their mothers sewed clothes, how they prepared food, how they cared for the house. They saw how their fathers worked, how they repaired tools, how they performed tasks that were necessary for survival. This learning through observation was so effective that children could often perform complex tasks simply by having seen their parents do them many times. But there was also more formal education. There were times when parents explicitly taught their children how to do things. There were verbal instructions. You do it this way, then this way, then this way. There was demonstration. The father or mother performed the task while the child watched. There was also practice. The child was allowed to try, often with help and guidance. Historical documents describe this education with details that reveal its sophistication. There was a careful progression. Children learned simple tasks first, then more complex tasks. There was an emphasis on doing things correctly. It wasn't enough to just do something. You had to do it well. There was also a transmission of values. Children learned not just how to do something, but why it was important to do it well. There was also a question of specialization. Not all children learned the same things. Girls often learned tasks that were considered feminine: sewing, cooking, housekeeping. Boys often learned tasks that were considered masculine: woodworking, metalworking, agricultural work. But there was also flexibility. If a child showed aptitude or interest in a task that was normally associated with the other gender, they could be taught. There was also the apprenticeship system. a formal structure where a young person was placed with a master to learn a specialized skill. This system was particularly important for skills that required years of practice to master: carpentry, metalworking, weaving, cooking. An apprentice would spend years, often 7 to 10 years, working with a master, learning not just the technical skill but also the secrets of the trade, the techniques that had been refined over generations. Historical documents describe these apprenticeships with fascinating detail. There were formal contracts that specified the terms of the apprenticeship. There was a clear progression. The apprentice began with simple tasks, then advanced to more complex tasks. There was also evaluation. At the end of the apprenticeship, the apprentice had to demonstrate that they had mastered the skill, often by creating a masterpiece that demonstrated their competence. But there was more than just technical skills being transmitted. There was also theoretical knowledge, understanding of the principles behind the techniques. A carpenter didn't just know how to make a joint. They understood why that joint was stronger than others, how different types of wood behaved, how climate affected wood. This theoretical knowledge was transmitted through conversation, through observation, through careful transmission of accumulated knowledge. There was also a question of how knowledge was preserved in written form. Although most people couldn't read or write, there were some written records. There were books about medicine, about agriculture, about cooking. There were also records kept by the church, documents that recorded events, that preserved knowledge. There were also recipes and instructions that were written, often in the form of rhymes or poetry, to facilitate memorization. Historical documents show that there was a valuation of written knowledge. Even if most people couldn't read, there were people who could. Priests, scribes, educated people, who could read these documents and transmit the knowledge to others. There was an understanding that written knowledge was a way of preserving information through time, of ensuring that knowledge wouldn't be lost if someone died. There was also a question of how knowledge was organized and categorized. There was knowledge that was considered essential, knowledge that everyone needed to know to survive. There was knowledge that was considered specialized, knowledge that only people in certain professions needed to know. There was also knowledge that was considered secret, knowledge that was carefully guarded by certain groups, that was transmitted only to those who were considered worthy. A particularly fascinating aspect of knowledge transmission during the Little Ice Age was the role of women. Although women often didn't have access to the formal education that men had, they were often the guardians of the practical knowledge that was essential for survival. There was knowledge about cooking, about medicinal cooking, about childcare, about caring for the sick. There was also knowledge about medicinal plants, about food preservation techniques, about weaving and sewing techniques. This knowledge was transmitted from mother to daughter through practice and observation. There was careful transmission of recipes, of techniques, of knowledge accumulated over generations. There was also a transmission of values, understanding of why it was important to do things in certain ways, of how certain practices were connected to community and family values. There was also a question of how knowledge was tested and refined. It wasn't enough to just transmit knowledge, the knowledge had to work. If a food preservation technique didn't work, it was abandoned. If a cooking technique didn't produce good results, it was modified. There was continuous experimentation, continuous refinement, continuous improvement of techniques based on practical experience. Historical documents show that there was real sophistication in this refinement process. There were discussions about why certain techniques worked better than others. There was transmission of knowledge about the reasons behind the techniques, not just the techniques themselves. There was also openness to new ideas. If someone discovered a better way of doing something, that discovery was often adopted and transmitted to others. There was also a question of how knowledge was used to solve new problems. When temperatures fell even further during the Little Ice Age, when challenges became even greater, communities didn't just repeat old techniques, They adapted these techniques, they modified them, they developed new solutions based on knowledge they already had. An example of this was how construction techniques evolved during the Little Ice Age. Communities started with construction techniques that had been used for centuries, but as the cold became more severe, they modified these techniques. They developed new ways of insulating houses, new ways of retaining heat, new ways of building structures that were both warm and structurally sound. There was also a question of how knowledge was transmitted between different communities. There wasn't complete isolation, albeit there was trade, there was travel, there was communication between communities. When one community would develop a new technique that worked well, that technique was often adopted by other communities. There was a diffusion of knowledge through trade networks, through travel, through marriages that connected different communities. Historical documents show that there were people who traveled from community to community, sharing knowledge. There were master craftsmen who moved to different cities, bringing their techniques with them. There were also merchants who shared information about what worked in different regions. This circulation of knowledge was important to ensure that the best techniques were widely adopted. There was also a question of how knowledge was preserved during times of crisis. When a community was devastated by an epidemic, when many people died, there was a real risk that the knowledge those people possessed would be lost. To prevent this, there was accelerated transmission of knowledge. Older people taught younger people intensively, ensuring that essential knowledge was preserved. There was also a question of how knowledge was transmitted across generations when there were large gaps. When most people of one generation died, when there were few survivors to teach the next generation. In these situations, there was a reconstruction of knowledge. People tried to remember what their ancestors had done, tried to reconstruct techniques based on fragments of memory. This was often less effective than direct transmission, but it was better than nothing. A particularly important aspect of knowledge transmission was how it created cultural continuity. When you learned a skill from your father or mother, you weren't just learning a technique. You were connecting with a tradition that extended through the centuries. You were participating in a practice that your ancestors had performed, that your descendants would perform. This continuity provided a sense of meaning and purpose. When you think about all this, and about how communities transmitted knowledge, about how they refined and adapted techniques, about how they ensured that essential knowledge was preserved and transmitted to the next generation, you realized that the Little Ice Age was a period of continuous innovation. It wasn't innovation in the modern sense. There were no laboratories, there was no formal research, but it was real innovation based on careful observation, on experimentation, on careful transmission of knowledge. And there was still one final crucial aspect of this story. Something that had to do with how people reflected on their experiences, with how they understood the meaning of everything they had gone through, with how they saw the legacy they were leaving for the future. When you're living through a crisis, it's hard to imagine that it will end. For people who lived during the Little Ice Age, especially those who lived during the coldest centuries, at the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, it may have seemed that the cold was a permanent condition of human existence. That winter would last forever, that temperatures would never rise again, that the world their ancestors had known, a slightly warmer, slightly more generous world, was just a legend, a story that was told, but that had never been real. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. Temperatures began to rise. Winters began to be a little less severe. Harvests began to be a little more abundant. The process was gradual. There was no defined moment when people woke up and said, "Oh, the Little Ice Age has ended." But over the course of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, global temperatures began to increase and the world began to warm. This warming had multiple causes. There were changes in solar activity, there were changes in volcanic activity, There were also possibly changes in ocean currents that affected global climate. Scientists still debate exactly what the most important causes were, but the result was clear. The planet was warming and the Little Ice Age was coming to an end. But here's something fascinating. When the cold began to diminish, societies didn't simply return to what they were before. The changes that had occurred during the Little Ice Age, the innovations, the adaptations, the new forms of social organization, these changes persisted. The architecture that had been developed to retain heat continued to be used. The agricultural techniques that had been refined continued to be practiced. The social structures that had been developed to ensure collective survival continued to influence how communities were organized. And there was also a question of how people understood what had happened. There was reflection on the centuries of suffering, on the generations that had lived through extreme cold, on the innovations that had been developed. There was an understanding that although the cold had been a curse, it had also been a blessing in a strange way. It had forced people to innovate. It had forced communities to organize in new ways. It had created a resilience and a creativity that might otherwise never have been developed. Historical documents from the end of the Little Ice Age frequently contain reflections on this era. There was an understanding that people who had lived during extreme cold had developed skills and knowledge that were valuable. There was a valuation of the techniques that had been developed. There was also an understanding that these techniques could be useful in the future. That even if the world was warming, there was always the possibility that the cold would return, and therefore it was important to preserve the knowledge of how to survive extreme cold. There was also a question of how the Little Ice Age had shaped European culture. The architectural innovations that had been developed became part of the cultural identity of different regions. The food dishes that had been developed to provide heat became traditional dishes that were prepared even when there was no need for extra heat. The celebrations and parties that had been developed to maintain morale during winter became traditions that persisted through the centuries. An example of this was Christmas. During the Little Ice Age, Christmas had become a particularly important celebration. It was an occasion to gather with family, to share food, to find joy during the darkest winter. These Christmas practices that had been developed during the Little Ice Age persisted and became part of European cultural tradition. Many of the Christmas practices you see today, decorating houses, sharing special food, gathering with family, have their roots in practices that were developed during the Little Ice Age. There was also a question of how the Little Ice Age had affected the political and social history of Europe. The extreme cold had created pressures that led to social changes. It had led to the development of stronger community structures. It had led to greater emphasis on cooperation and resource sharing. It had also led to conflicts. When resources were scarce, there was competition for available resources, and this often led to conflicts between communities. Historical documents show that there was a correlation between the coldest periods of the Little Ice Age and periods of political and social instability. There were wars that were fueled by resource scarcity. There were revolutions that were motivated by hunger and poverty. There were also migrations. People left regions that were particularly affected by the cold and moved to regions that were slightly warmer or that had more resources. But there was also a question of how people understood the relationship between climate and society. The Little Ice Age had dramatically demonstrated how climate could affect human life, how climate changes could have profound social and political consequences. This understanding would influence how people thought about climate in the centuries that followed. When you look at the modern world and think about the climate issues we face today, there's an interesting irony. We are now facing the opposite of the problem that people faced during the Little Ice Age. Instead of a world that is becoming colder, we have a world that is becoming warmer. But there are lessons we can learn from the way people dealt with the Little Ice Age. The first lesson is that climate change has real and profound consequences for human life. It's not just an abstract matter of average global temperatures, it's a matter of how people live, of how communities organize, of how societies function. The Little Ice Age demonstrated this dramatically. The second lesson is that people have a remarkable ability to adapt to extreme circumstances. When faced with challenges that seem impossible, people find ways to innovate, to reorganize, to find solutions. The Little Ice Age demonstrated this ability impressively. The third lesson is that community is crucial for survival. The people who survived the Little Ice Age weren't those who tried to survive alone. They were those who organized into communities, who shared resources, who worked together. This lesson is particularly relevant today when there's a tendency toward isolation and individualism. The fourth lesson is that knowledge is power. The communities that survived were those that developed knowledge about how to deal with the cold, that refined this knowledge over generations, that carefully transmitted it to the next generation. This knowledge was as important as physical resources. The fifth lesson is that hope and psychological resilience are as important as physical resources. The people who survived were those who found ways to maintain hope, to find meaning and joy even in extremely adverse circumstances. This ability to maintain hope was as important as the ability to keep physically warm. When you think about the Little Ice Age in its entirety, about the 550 years of extreme cold, about the generations of people who lived through it, about the innovations that were developed, about the communities that were created, about the knowledge that was accumulated, you realize that it was an extraordinary era. It wasn't an era that people wished to live through. The suffering was real, death was frequent, life was difficult. But it was an era that shaped human history in profound ways. The people who lived during the Little Ice Age developed a resilience, a creativity, an ability to innovate that is remarkable. They created solutions that are still used today. They developed social structures that still influence how communities function. They accumulated knowledge that is still valuable, and they left a legacy that still inspires us today. When you're going through difficulties in your own life, when you're facing challenges that seem impossible to overcome, there's something you can learn from the people who lived during the Little Ice Age. You can learn that people have a remarkable ability to adapt, to innovate, to find solutions to problems that seem unsolvable. You can learn that community is important, that you don't have to face challenges alone. You can learn that hope is important, that finding meaning and joy, even in difficult times, is crucial for survival. If you're appreciating these stories that connect the past to the present, that reveal how people lived in past eras and that offer lessons for our modern lives, leave a comment sharing which of these lessons you find most relevant to your own life. We'd love to hear how these stories of human resilience and creativity resonate with you. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is the perfect time to do so. Each subscription helps us continue creating stories that educate, that relax, that inspire. Enable notifications to ensure you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that explore the fascinating secrets of how people lived in past eras. We want you to be part of this journey with us, to share these stories with your friends and family, to help us build a community of people who appreciate history, who value human creativity, who recognize the lessons the past can teach us. But while the Little Ice Age ended, while the world began to warm, there's still a question that remains, a question that is perhaps the most important of all. There's a question about what it all means, about what we can learn from this extraordinary era, about how we can apply these lessons in our own lives and in our communities. You've reached the end of this journey through 550 years of extreme cold, of innovation, of human resilience, of creativity that flourished in circumstances that should have led to total collapse. You've explored how people kept warm, how they built, how they ate, how they organized socially, how they maintained hope. You've seen how every aspect of daily life was transformed by the need to survive extreme cold. But now, as you settle in for this final reflection, there's a question that should echo in your mind with ever-increasing clarity. Why does all this matter? Why should we care about how people lived 500 years ago? What can the Little Ice Age teach us about our own lives, about our own challenges, about the world we live in today? The answer is profound and multifaceted, and it begins with a simple understanding. We are the descendants of those people. The blood that runs through your veins is the blood of those who survived the Little Ice Age. The genes you carry are genes that were selected for their ability to survive extreme cold, for their ability to adapt to adverse circumstances. You're not just a distant observer of history. You're a participant in it. You're a result of it. You carry in your body and mind the legacy of those who came before you. But there's more than just biological inheritance involved. There's also cultural inheritance. Many of the practices you perform today, many of the ways you live, have their roots in the Little Ice Age. The way your house is built, the food you eat, the celebrations you participate in, the social structures you live in, all these things were shaped, directly or indirectly, by the adaptations people developed during the Little Ice Age. When you sit down to a comfortable winter meal, when you warm yourself by a fireplace or heater, when you gather with your family during winter holidays, you're participating in traditions that have their roots in that era. You're living a legacy that was transmitted through generations, that was refined and adapted over centuries, but that still bears the marks of that extraordinary period. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Little Ice Age isn't about the past, it's about the present and the future. Because when you study how people dealt with an extreme climate challenge, when you see how they innovated, how they adapted, how they found ways to not just survive but thrive, you realize something important. People have a remarkable ability to deal with extreme adversities. We live in a world that faces its own climate challenges. We face climate change that is caused by human activities, that is transforming our planet in ways we still don't fully understand. We face a future that is uncertain, that may be challenging, that may require profound adaptations in how we live. And when you think about this, when you consider what lies ahead, it can be easy to fall into despair, into a sense that the challenges are too great, that there's nothing we can do. But the Little Ice Age offers us a different perspective. It shows us that people, when faced with extreme challenges, find ways to innovate. It shows us that communities, when they work together, can achieve remarkable things. It shows us that human creativity is a powerful force that can be unleashed when there's need. It shows us that hope and resilience aren't just abstract feelings. They're practical tools that allow people to continue living, to continue working, to continue creating even in extremely adverse circumstances. There's also a lesson about the importance of knowledge. During the Little Ice Age, the communities that survived were those that developed knowledge, that refined it, that transmitted it to the next generation. We live in an age where we have access to more knowledge than any previous generation in human history. We have the ability to learn from anyone, anywhere, at any time. We have the ability to share discoveries instantly across the world. And yet we often don't use this knowledge effectively. Often we let knowledge remain isolated, remain in silos, not be shared in ways that could benefit all of humanity. The Little Ice Age teaches us that knowledge is power, that shared knowledge is even more powerful, that the transmission of knowledge through generations is crucial for survival and progress. If we were more like the communities of the Little Ice Age, if we shared knowledge more generously, if we focused on transmitting knowledge to the next generation, if we valued the accumulated wisdom of past generations, perhaps we would be better equipped to deal with the challenges we face. There's also a lesson about the importance of community. We live in a world that often values individualism, that emphasizes the importance of being independent, of being self-sufficient, of not depending on anyone. But the Little Ice Age shows us that this is a dangerous illusion. No one survives alone. No one thrives in isolation. Survival is fundamentally a collective matter. The communities that survived the Little Ice Age were those that understood this, that organized around this understanding, that developed structures that ensured everyone was cared for, that everyone had a chance to survive. If we were more like these communities, if we focused on building stronger communities, if we shared resources more equitably, if we recognized that our survival is interconnected, that everyone's well-being is important for each person's well-being, perhaps we would be better equipped to deal with the challenges we face. Perhaps we would have less inequality, less suffering, less conflict. There's also a lesson about the importance of finding meaning and joy even in difficult times. The people who lived during the Little Ice Age didn't just survive, they also lived. They celebrated, they danced, they sang, they told stories, they found beauty and joy in simple things. They understood that life had value even in extremely adverse circumstances, that there was reason to continue living even when the future was uncertain. We live in a world that often tells us we should always be productive, always busy, always focused on future goals. We often neglect the present, neglect simple moments of joy, neglect the importance of gathering with other people, of sharing stories, of finding meaning in our daily lives. The Little Ice Age teaches us that this is a mistake, that joy and meaning aren't luxuries. They're necessities, they're tools for psychological survival that are as important as food and shelter. There's also a lesson about the importance of preparation and planning. The communities that survived the Little Ice Age were those that prepared for winter, that stored resources, that carefully planned how they would deal with the cold months. We live in a world that often lives from day to day, that doesn't adequately prepare for future challenges, that postpones important decisions until it's too late. The Little Ice Age teaches us that preparation is important, that planning is important, that foresight is important. But perhaps the deepest lesson of all is about the nature of change. The Little Ice Age shows us that the world changes, that circumstances change, that conditions that seem permanent are actually temporary. The people who lived during the Little Ice Age couldn't have imagined that the cold would end, that the world would warm, that a new era would begin. But that's exactly what happened. And when the world began to change, people adapted. They didn't simply return to what they were before. They brought with them the innovations they had developed, the structures they had created, the knowledge they had accumulated. This is an important lesson for us. We live in a world that is changing rapidly. We face challenges that are different from the challenges any previous generation faced. We don't know exactly how the future will unfold, but we can learn from the people who lived during the Little Ice Age that change is possible, that adaptation is possible, that even in extremely adverse circumstances, people can find ways to not just survive, but thrive. When you think about all this, about the lessons the Little Ice Age can teach us, about how these lessons are relevant to our lives today, about how we can apply this accumulated wisdom over 550 years to deal with our own challenges, you realize that history isn't just about the past. History is about us. History is about who we are, where we come from, where we're going. The people who lived during the Little Ice Age left a legacy for us. They left innovations, knowledge, social structures, an understanding of how people can adapt to adverse circumstances. But they also left a question: what will we do with this legacy? How will we use the wisdom they accumulated? How will we apply the lessons we've learned from their experiences? The answer to these questions depends on us. It depends on how we choose to live, on how we choose to relate to others, on how we choose to prepare for the future. It depends on whether we recognize that we're part of a story that extends through the centuries, that we're responsible not just for our own lives, but also for the legacy we leave for future generations. As you settle in to sleep, as you leave this story behind and return to your daily life, there's something you can take with you. You can take the understanding that people have a remarkable ability to adapt to innovate, to find joy and meaning even in difficult times. You can take the understanding that community is important, that you're not alone, that there are other people around you facing challenges similar to yours. You can take the understanding that knowledge is power, that the transmission of knowledge is important, that you have the responsibility to share what you know with others. And you can take the understanding that hope is important, that finding meaning and joy in your life is important, that you have the power to create change in your own life and in the lives of others around you. The Little Ice Age ended more than 150 years ago, but its legacy remains. It remains in the houses we live in the food we eat, in the communities we form, in the social structures we maintain, in the knowledge we transmit. And this legacy will continue to influence our lives, will continue to teach us, will continue to inspire us as we face our own challenges and build our own future. Thank you for being with us on this journey. Thank you for dedicating your time to exploring this extraordinary period of human history. Thank you for allowing these stories to accompany you as you prepared for sleep, as you relaxed, as you reflected on the meaning of it all. May you sleep well, may you wake refreshed, and may you carry the lessons of the Little Ice Age with you as you live your own life and face your own challenges. Good night, everyone. May you rest well and may you wake with a new appreciation for human resilience, for creativity, for the ability that all of us have to adapt, to innovate, to find hope, even in the most challenging circumstances. Until the next story.